The heavy oak doors of the cathedral were supposed to be Amelia's gateway to a happily ever after. Instead, she stood at the altar, the harsh feedback of a stolen microphone echoing through the vaulted ceilings as her future mother-in-law publicly branded her a penniless fraud. 800 of New York's elite gasped. Her fiancé, the man who had promised her the world, slowly let go of her hand and stepped away in disgust. Amelia was entirely alone, humiliated on the grandest scale imaginable. But just as the security guards marched forward to drag the trash out of the church, the cathedral doors didn't just open, they violently burst apart, and the deafening roar of military-grade helicopters outside told everyone in the room that they had made a catastrophic mistake. To understand the sheer magnitude of the disaster that unfolded at St. Patrick's Cathedral, you first have to understand the Whitmore family. The Whitmores were not just wealthy, they were institutional. They possessed the kind of old, generational Manhattan money that bought buildings, silenced scandals, and dictated the social hierarchy of the Upper East Side. Charles Whitmore was a hedge fund titan who communicated entirely through nods and grunts, while his wife, Brianna Whitmore, was the undisputed queen of their social circle. Brianna was a woman carved from ice and draped in Chanel, a matriarch who viewed her family's bloodline as a sovereign nation that needed protecting from invaders. Their golden boy and heir apparent was Preston. At 32, Preston was undeniably handsome, equipped with a Yale degree, a trust fund that rivaled the GDP of a small island, and a spine made of absolute jelly. He had spent his entire life bending to his mother's will, a habit he swore he had broken the day he met Amelia Hayes. Amelia was a glaring anomaly in the Whitmore universe. At 28, she possessed an understated, devastating beauty. But she didn't wear designer labels, she didn't summer in the Hamptons, and she didn't care about status. She worked as a senior archivist and art restorer at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, living in a charming but modest walk-up apartment in Brooklyn. When Preston first spotted her meticulously cleaning a 16th-century tapestry, he was instantly captivated by her quiet grace and razor-sharp intellect. He pursued her relentlessly. For the first time in his life, Preston defied his mother, insisting that Amelia was the woman he was going to marry. Brianna Whitmore, naturally, declared a silent, psychological war. From the moment Preston brought Amelia to the Whitmore penthouse overlooking Central Park, Brianna treated the girl like a pest infestation. The psychological warfare started subtly. At intimate family dinners, Brianna would pointedly ask Amelia questions designed to highlight her inferior background. "Amelia, darling," Brianna would purr, swirling a glass of 50-year-old Bordeaux. "Preston tells me your parents are entirely out of the picture." "Traveling in Europe," he said. "How delightfully bohemian. Do they backpack or simply hitchhike?" Amelia would simply smile, her posture perfectly straight. "They travel extensively for work, Mrs. Whitmore. They prefer to stay out of the public eye." "How convenient," Brianna would sneer, glancing at her husband. When the subtle digs didn't break Amelia, Brianna escalated her tactics. She began inviting Victoria DuPont to every family gathering. Victoria was a shipping heiress, a blonde, statuesque socialite who had been Brianna's hand-picked choice for Preston since they were toddlers. During a weekend getaway to the Whitmore estate in Newport, Brianna orchestrated the seating arrangements so that Victoria sat next to Preston, while Amelia was relegated to the far end of the table next to an eccentric, deaf great-uncle. Throughout the dinner, Brianna loudly reminisced about Preston and Victoria's teenage romance, blatantly ignoring Amelia. Preston, true to his nature, would nervously pat Amelia's hand under the table, whispering, "Just ignore her. She's just traditional. She'll come around. But Brianna had no intention of coming around. 2 weeks before the wedding, Brianna ambushed Amelia in the library of the penthouse. She didn't come alone. She brought the family's lead attorney. Without a word of greeting, Brianna slammed a 70-page prenuptial agreement onto the mahogany desk. "Sign it," Brianna commanded. "If you actually love my son and not his bank accounts, this shouldn't be an issue." Amelia skimmed the first few pages. It was a draconian, insulting document. It stipulated that Amelia would receive absolutely no alimony, that she had to maintain a specific body weight, that any children would remain in the sole custody of the Whitmores in the event of a divorce, and that she forfeited all rights to her own public image. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, knowing the document was practically a violation of human rights. Amelia didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply picked up a heavy Mont Blanc pen from the desk, flipped to the back page, and signed her name with a fluid, elegant flourish. "There," Amelia said softly, her voice carrying an unshakable calm that sent a bizarre shiver down Brianna's spine. "I don't want your money, Mrs. Whitmore. I never have." Brianna snatched the contract back, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. Amelia's lack of resistance didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a taunt. It drove Brianna absolutely mad. She decided that a legal document wasn't enough to protect her son. She needed to destroy Amelia Hayes completely, publicly, and irreversibly. The week of the wedding, Brianna initiated the final phase of her plan. She quietly hired Kroll, one of the most ruthless and expensive private intelligence agencies in the world. Her instructions were simple. Find dirt on Amelia Hayes. Find the hidden debts, the secret lovers, the criminal records. Bring me the evidence that she is a gold-digging fraud. However, when the Kroll investigators returned 3 days later, they looked genuinely perplexed. The lead investigator slid a thin manila folder across Brianna's desk. "Mrs. Whitmore, there is virtually nothing. Amelia Hayes has no debt, no criminal record. Strangely, her financial footprint before she moved to New York 5 years ago is entirely completely redacted. It's walled off by international privacy laws we can't pierce without a federal subpoena." "Redacted?" Brianna hissed. "People with clean pasts don't have redacted files." "Whoa, she's hiding something massive." "Perhaps," the investigator said cautiously. "But we have no proof of malice." "If you won't find the proof," Brianna sneered, pulling out her checkbook, "I will simply create it." Brianna paid a small fortune to a shady associate to fabricate a devastating dossier. It contained forged bank statements showing Amelia hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, fake wire transfers suggesting she was funneling Whitmore money to an offshore account, and doctored emails implying she was working with a European con ring. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. The morning of the wedding arrived, cloaked in an unusually heavy, overcast sky. The bridal suite at the Plaza Hotel was a whirlwind of makeup artists, florists, and nervous energy. Amelia stood on a pedestal, looking breathtaking in a custom, hand-beaded, Vera Wang silk gown. Suddenly, Preston's younger sister, Chloe Whitmore, strutted into the room, holding a brimming glass of dark cherry mimosa. Chloe was a carbon copy of her mother, spiteful, entitled, and entirely complicit in the plan. "Oh, Amelia, you look quaint," Chloe said, feigning a clumsy trip on the thick hotel carpet. She lurched forward, throwing the dark red liquid directly onto the front of Amelia's pristine white silk gown. The room went dead silent. The makeup artists gasped. A massive, jagged, crimson stain bled across the delicate silk, ruining tens of thousands of dollars of handiwork in a single second. "Oops," Chloe said, a vicious smirk playing on her lips. I am so clumsy. Good thing it's not too late to call the whole thing off. The bridal party braced for a meltdown. Brides had thrown screaming tantrums for far less, but Amelia just looked at the stain, then up at Chloe. Amelia's eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of panic. "Hand me the scissors," Amelia said calmly to a terrified tailor. "Ma'am," the tailor stammered. "The scissors, now." With ruthless precision, Amelia began to cut. She sheared away the stained fabric, effortlessly altering the design on the fly. Within 15 minutes, she had transformed the ruined traditional ball gown into a striking avant-garde high-low dress that showed off her elegant legs and designer heels. It was bold, modern, and arguably looked better than the original. Chloe's jaw dropped in silent fury. Amelia didn't let them break her. An hour later, Amelia arrived at St. Patrick's Cathedral. The streets of Manhattan were blocked off. Paparazzi and society reporters from Page 6 and Vogue swarmed the stone steps. Inside, 800 of the wealthiest people in America were seated in the wooden pews, the air heavy with the scent of white roses and expensive perfume. Amelia stood in the vestibule, waiting for the massive doors to open. She was walking down the aisle alone. She had told Preston that her parents, due to complicated travel restrictions, couldn't make it to America in time. Brianna had weaponized this fact all week, loudly whispering to anyone who would listen that Amelia was a pariah, abandoned by her own trailer park family. The majestic chords of Canon in D began to play. The heavy oak doors swung open. Amelia stepped forward. She looked like a queen. Her head was held high, her posture immaculate, her gaze fixed entirely on Preston, who stood at the altar. But as she walked down the long, sweeping aisle, she noticed the atmosphere was utterly wrong. People weren't smiling. They were whispering behind their hands. The wealthy guests exchanged sharp, judging glances. At the altar, Preston didn't look like a man in love. He looked terrified. He was sweating profusely, shifting his weight from foot to foot, glancing nervously at his mother in the front row. Brianna, adorned in a dark, almost mourning-like navy gown, sat with her back perfectly straight. She wasn't looking at Amelia. She was looking at the priest, holding a thick leather binder in her lap. A predatory smile etched across her face. Amelia reached the altar. Preston barely offered his hand to help her up the steps. His palms were clammy. "Preston, what's wrong?" Amelia whispered softly, only for him to hear. He couldn't even look her in the eye. I'm sorry, Amelia." Before she could process his words, the music faded into silence. The Archbishop stepped forward to begin the ceremony. "Dearly beloved," the Archbishop's voice boomed through the cathedral's massive acoustic space. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The traditional words flowed, echoing over the silent, expectant crowd. The tension in the air was so thick it was suffocating. Finally, the Archbishop reached the fateful, often ignored formality of the ceremony. "If anyone can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace." Usually this is followed by a few seconds of polite, breathless silence. Not today. The scraping of heavy wood against stone echoed through the church as Brianna Whitmore stood up from the front pew. "I have cause," Brianna announced, her voice ringing out crisp, clear, and dripping with venom. A collective gasp ripped through the cathedral. Whispers exploded among the 800 guests. Flash bulbs went off near the rear doors where a few rogue paparazzi had snuck in. The Archbishop looked bewildered, adjusting his glasses. "Madam, this is highly unusual." "What is unusual, Your Eminence?" Brianna interrupted. stepping out into the center aisle and turning to face the sea of billionaires, politicians, and socialites, is allowing a common grifter to defile this sacred altar. Brianna reached into her leather binder and pulled out a wireless microphone. She had literally brought her own audio equipment to ensure her voice carried to the back rows. For months, this woman has paraded around our family, playing the part of a humble, innocent art restorer. Brianna's voice boomed, dripping with theatrical sorrow. She gestured wildly to Amelia. But the Whitmore family does not act blindly. We investigated Amelia Hayes, and what we found is sickening. Brianna began signaling to ushers stationed at the ends of the pews. They began handing out thick manila folders to the guests in the front rows. Inside these folders you will find bank statements, Brianna declared triumphantly. You will see that Amelia Hayes is currently $500,000 in debt. You will see fraudulent wire transfers attempting to access Preston's trust. She's not a woman in love. She's a desperate, destitute con artist from a bankrupt, broken family trying to secure a payday before she gets indicted. The cathedral erupted. Guests were flipping through the fake documents, murmuring in shock. Victoria DuPont sat a few rows back, visibly smirking. Amelia stood perfectly still. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She slowly turned her head to look at the man she was about to marry. "Preston," Amelia said, her voice steady, cutting through the rising noise. "Look at me. You know me. You know none of this is true. Tell them." Preston looked like a cornered animal. He looked at the angry faces in the crowd. He looked at his mother's commanding glare, and finally, he looked at the woman he claimed to love. The pressure of his family's legacy, the terror of his mother's wrath, broke whatever tiny bit of backbone he had left. Preston took a slow step backward, physically distancing himself from Amelia. He dropped his gaze to the marble floor. "I can't," Preston mumbled into his lapel microphone, his voice echoing tragically. "I'm sorry, Amelia. My mother, she showed me the files last night. I can't marry a fraud. I can't let you steal from my family." The betrayal was absolute. It was public, it was cruel, and it was final. Brianna smiled, a terrifying grin of pure victory. She turned to the heavy security detail lining the walls. "Remove this trash from the church," Brianna ordered. "Throw her out on Fifth Avenue where she belongs." Two massive men in dark suits stepped forward, reaching out to grab Amelia's arms. "Don't touch me," Amelia said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The quiet archivist from Brooklyn vanished. In her place stood a woman radiating an ancient, terrifying authority. Amelia slowly reached up, pulled the multi-million-dollar diamond engagement ring off her finger, and let it drop. It hit the marble floor with a sharp clink that echoed through the sudden, uneasy silence of the cathedral. "You wanted to know about my family, Brianna?" Amelia asked softly, though the acoustics carried her voice perfectly. "You are about to meet them." Suddenly, the stained glass windows of the cathedral began to vibrate. It started as a low hum, then built into a deafening, rhythmic thunder. The roar of the heavy helicopter rotors washed over the building, shaking the ancient stone. Outside, the screech of heavy tires and the blaring of unfamiliar European-style police sirens shattered the quiet Manhattan morning. The guests turned in their pews, panic flashing in their eyes. Before the cathedral's security could move, the massive 20-foot-high front doors didn't just open, they were violently shoved apart. Daylight poured into the dark church, silhouetting a terrifying sight. Over 36 men in tactical black suits, earpieces, and heavily armed with weaponry far exceeding standard NYPD issue poured into the vestibule. They moved with terrifying, synchronized military precision, instantly disarming Brianna's private security guards and tossing them to the floor like rag dolls. They formed a solid, impenetrable barricade down the center aisle. The guests screamed. Preston fell backward onto the altar steps in sheer terror. Brianna dropped her microphone, her face draining of all color. Through the corridor of armed men, a single figure walked forward. He was an older gentleman with silver hair, dressed in a flawless, bespoke Brioni suit. On his lapel gleamed a heavy gold pin, a sovereign crest recognized by every foreign diplomat in the world. It was Ambassador Henrik von Tyson. He ignored the screaming billionaires. He ignored Brianna. He walked straight down the aisle, climbed the altar steps, and stopped directly in front of Amelia. To the absolute horror of the Whitmore family, the ambassador fell to one knee, bowing his head deeply. "Your Royal Highness," the ambassador's voice rang out with booming, undeniable authority. "His Majesty the King sends his deepest regrets for the delay. The airspace clearance was obstructed. But your convoy is here now. It is time to go home, Princess Amelia." The silence inside St. Patrick's Cathedral was so profound you could hear the distant, muffled thud of the helicopter blades slicing through the damp Manhattan air outside. 800 of New York's most powerful people were frozen, their brains desperately trying to process the impossible scene unfolding at the altar. Ambassador Henrik von Tyson remained kneeling on the cold marble floor. The heavy gold crest on his lapel caught the light, the undisputed insignia of the sovereign house of Habsburg Savoy. It was a European monarchy that didn't just have titles. They had a sovereign wealth fund that controlled major stakes in global tech, European shipping lines, and massive reserves of natural resources. They were old money, quiet money, terrifying money. Brianna Whitmore was the first to break the silence. Her mind simply refused to accept the reality in front of her. "What is this?" Brianna shrilled, her voice cracking, dropping all pretense of aristocratic poise. She pointed a trembling finger at the tactical team blocking the aisle. "Is this a joke? She hired actors. Preston, look at this. This is just another one of her psychotic cons." Ambassador von Tyson didn't even turn his head to acknowledge Brianna. To him, she was a buzzing insect. He kept his eyes lowered in deference to Amelia. Amelia looked down at the ambassador, her posture transforming. The slight, protective hunch of a woman trying to blend into a normal Brooklyn life completely vanished. Her spine straightened, her chin tilted upward. The quiet, gentle archivist was gone, replaced by Her Royal Highness, Princess Amelia Helene of Habsburg Savoy. "You may rise, Henrik," Amelia said. Her voice was no longer soft. It carried the crisp, commanding cadence of someone who had been trained to rule since birth. "Thank you, Your Highness," the ambassador said, standing tall. "The security perimeter is secured. We have 2 Eurocopters waiting on 5th Avenue. The NYPD has granted emergency airspace clearance under diplomatic protocol. We must leave immediately." Amelia nodded slowly. She turned to look at Preston one last time. Preston was still sitting on the altar steps, his face completely drained of blood, looking like a little boy who had just watched his house burn down. He looked from the heavily armed guards to the ambassador, and finally to Amelia. The realization of what he had done was just beginning to claw at the edges of his mind. "Amelia?" Preston whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the syllables. "A princess? I didn't know, huh?" Amelia looked down at him, her eyes completely devoid of anger, which was somehow much worse than rage. It was absolute, chilling indifference. "No, Preston, you didn't know," Amelia said, her voice echoing through the cathedral's microphone system. I spent my entire life suffocated by titles, by wealth, by people who only loved me for what my family controlled. I moved to New York under a protected identity because I wanted just once to know what it felt like to be loved simply for who I am. She stepped closer to him, her shadow falling over his cowering form. I gave you every opportunity to prove you were a man. Amelia continued, her words slicing through the dead silent church like scalpels. I gave you the chance to stand by me, to protect me. But the moment your mother waved a fabricated folder in your face, you threw me to the wolves. Amelia, please, they lied to me, Preston begged, reaching out a shaking hand. Amelia stepped back, utterly out of his reach. You don't deserve the woman from Brooklyn, and you certainly cannot afford the princess of Amsbury-Savoy. She turned her back on him. Henrik, get me out of this circus. At once, Your Highness, the ambassador replied. He raised 2 fingers. The tactical team, 36 elite operatives from the Royal Guard, shifted seamlessly. They formed a tight, impenetrable diamond formation around Amelia. As she walked back down the long center aisle, the billionaire guests, the titans of Wall Street, and the haughty socialites physically shrank back into their pews. Nobody dared to breathe, let alone speak. Brianna Whitmore tried to step into the aisle, her face flushed red with manic fury. You can't do this. Who do you think you are? 2 massive men in black tactical gear instantly stepped into Brianna's path, their hands resting ominously on the grips of their holstered sidearms. The look in their eyes was so violently cold that Brianna physically recoiled, stumbling backward into the wooden pew. Amelia didn't even look at her former mother-in-law. She walked out of the heavy oak doors and into the chaotic daylight of Fifth Avenue. The scene outside was apocalyptic. The NYPD had cordoned off 3 city blocks. 2 massive matte black military-grade helicopters were sitting squarely in the middle of Fifth Avenue, their rotors churning the air into a deafening storm. Boye! Sirens wailed as Secret Service and diplomatic security vehicles formed a perimeter. The paparazzi, initially there to cover a high society wedding, were screaming, their cameras firing like strobe lights as they captured the impossible image of a bride in an avant-garde gown being escorted by foreign military into a waiting chopper. Amelia climbed into the plush leather interior of the lead helicopter. The door slammed shut. Within seconds, the aircraft lifted off the asphalt, banking hard over the skyscrapers of Manhattan, leaving the Whitmore family utterly destroyed in its wake. Inside the church, the immediate aftermath was pure pandemonium. The moment the helicopters faded, the 800 guests erupted into chaos. Phones were yanked out of pockets. Hedge fund managers frantically dialed their offices. Society columnists were aggressively typing out texts. Chloe Whitmore stood near the altar, her mouth hanging open. Mom, she squeaked, grabbing Brianna's arm. Mom, what just happened? Brianna brushed her daughter off, staring blankly at the massive empty doorway. It's a trick. It's a sophisticated parlor trick. She doesn't have money. She's a fraud. But a few rows back, a prominent investment banker was staring at his Bloomberg terminal app on his phone, his face pale. He looked up, his voice cutting through the noise. Brianna, the banker yelled over the murmuring crowd. The House of Amsburg-Savoy. They control the AS Global Vanguard Fund. They manage nearly $900 billion in sovereign assets. Brianna, what have you done? By the time the guests began fleeing the cathedral, the global news cycle had already exploded. The Wall Street Journal, CNN, and Financial Times broke into their regular programming. The internet effectively melted down. Page 6 immediately ran the headline, Royal Nightmare, Whitmore Air Dumps Fake Pauper, Loses $1 trillion Princess at the Altar. Social media erupted. Cell phone footage from inside the church, recorded secretly by a younger cousin of the groom, leaked to X, formerly Twitter, and TikTok within 3 hours. The video of Brianna Whitmore screaming into a microphone, followed by the terrifying arrival of the Royal Guard, had amassed over 80 million views. Amelia Hayes was trending #1 globally. The world now knew exactly who she was, and worse, they knew exactly what the Whitmore family had done to her. The weekend that followed was described by New York society as the longest, quietest funeral in Manhattan history. The Whitmore family locked themselves inside their sprawling Central Park penthouse, refusing to answer the phone, pulling the heavy velvet drapes closed as hundreds of news fans, paparazzi, and curious onlookers swarmed the streets below. Charles Whitmore, the patriarch of the family and CEO of Whitmore Capital, spent the entire weekend drinking scotch and yelling at his lawyers. Brianna paced the marble floors, taking fistfuls of anxiety medication, continuously trying to convince herself that the Kroll documents she had bought were somehow real, and the royal display was just a massive European scam. But Monday morning arrived, bringing with it a reality so brutal it would permanently rewrite Wall Street history. When the financial markets opened at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Charles Whitmore was sitting at his massive desk on the 45th floor of his Midtown office. Whitmore Capital managed roughly $40 billion in assets. It was a massive firm, but in the grand scheme of global finance, it was a goldfish swimming in an ocean of sharks. At exactly 9:31 a.m., Charles's private phone rang. It was his chief financial officer, and the man was hyperventilating. "Charles," the CFO gasped, "you need to look at the terminal right now." Charles clicked his mouse, bringing up the global liquidity monitors. What he saw made his blood run completely cold. A coordinated, apocalyptic financial assault was underway. It wasn't loud. It wasn't physical. It was the terrifying, silent wrath of unlimited sovereign wealth. The House of Amtberg-Savoy didn't send assassins or issue angry public statements. Princess Amelia's father, King Carl Johann, simply made 3 phone calls from his palace in Europe. The first call was to the board of the AS Global Vanguard Fund. Within seconds, the Royal Sovereign Wealth Fund liquidated their entire indirect holding in Whitmore Capital. But they didn't stop there. They aggressively shorted the stock of every single major publicly traded company that Whitmore Capital was heavily invested in. The second call was to the royal family's banking partners in Geneva, London, and Wall Street. At 9:45 a.m., the compliance department at Goldman Sachs sent a brief, automated email to Charles Whitmore's office. They were immediately recalling their multi-billion-dollar line of credit. Morgan Stanley followed suit 5 minutes later. J.P. Morgan Chase completely froze the Whitmore corporate accounts, pending an internal risk assessment. "Why is this happening?" Charles screamed into the phone at his lead broker. "They can't just call in our debts all at once. We have agreements. We have contracts." "Charles, listen to me," the broker said, his voice laced with pity and terror. "The Europeans are blacklisting you. The Amsberg-Savoy family just put out a shadow directive through their banking syndicate. Anyone who does business with Whitmore Capital loses the Crown's business forever. Nobody is going to choose you over a $1 trillion royal portfolio. You are radioactive, Charles. You're done." By 11 a.m., the panic on the trading floor was absolute. Clients were flooding the phone lines, demanding to withdraw their money. The institutional investors, smelling the blood in the water and terrified of angering the European royals, immediately pulled their funds. Whitmore Capital was experiencing a massive, historic bank run. Charles left his office and took the private elevator down to the lobby, flanked by security to avoid the press. He rushed back to the penthouse. He burst through the doors of his home, his face purple with rage. Brianna was sitting on the plush sofa, watching a CNN segment about Princess Amelia's safe return to her home country. "Charles, what are we going to do about this PR nightmare?" Brianna asked, waving a manicured hand at the television. "My country club membership was just suspended. It's absolutely ridiculous." Charles walked slowly across the room, grabbed the television remote and smashed it violently against the marble coffee table. Brianna shrieked, jumping up. "PR nightmare," Charles roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandelier. "Do you have any idea what you have done, Brianna? Do you understand what you unleashed on Friday?" "I was protecting our family," Brianna yelled back, her eyes wide. "She was a liar. She didn't tell us who she was." "She didn't tell us because she wanted a normal life," Charles bellowed, grabbing his wife by the shoulders. "You couldn't just leave it alone. You had to destroy her. You had to humiliate her in front of the entire world. Do you know what her father did this morning? King Carl Johan just financially decapitated me." Brianna scoffed, though her hands were shaking. "Don't be dramatic, Charles. We have billions." "Had!" Charles screamed, throwing his hands in the air. "We had billions. The banks froze our lines of credit. Our cornerstone investors just pulled out. We are facing margin calls we cannot cover. By Friday, Whitmore Capital will be insolvent. The SEC is already calling my compliance officers because the market volatility is so extreme. We are losing the firm, Brianna. We are losing this penthouse. We are losing everything, and it is entirely your fault." Brianna stumbled backward, falling onto the sofa. The color completely drained from her perfectly contoured face. For the first time in her life, the gravity of her actions penetrated her armor of arrogance. She wasn't untouchable. She had just picked a fight with a literal king, and she was being swatted like a fly. Upstairs, Preston lay in his dark bedroom, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed endlessly, with texts from his friends, former fraternity brothers, and business associates. They weren't offering condolences. They were mocking him. He had become the biggest joke on the planet, the arrogant heir who threw away a brilliant, beautiful princess because his mommy told him to. He looked at the news app on his phone. A new photo of Amelia had just been released by the Royal Press Office. She was stepping out of a black Maybach in Europe, flanked by suited guards. She was wearing a sharp, tailored blazer, her hair pulled back, looking terrifyingly powerful and radiantly beautiful. Preston dropped his phone, buried his face in his hands, and finally began to sob. While the financial destruction of the Whitmore family was swift and absolute, the legal and social consequences were designed to be a slow, agonizing torture. The first domino to fall in the legal arena was Kroll. When Brianna stood at the altar and loudly proclaimed she had hired Kroll to investigate Amelia, she made a fatal, arrogant mistake. Kroll is one of the most prestigious corporate intelligence and risk management firms on the planet. They pride themselves on absolute discretion and unbreakable factual accuracy. When the Kroll executives saw the viral video of Brianna Whitmore waving a folder full of forged bank statements and fake wire transfers while screaming their company's name, they went utterly nuclear. On Tuesday morning, Daniel Coulson, the global head of security and investigations at Kroll, held a massive press conference in Washington, D.C. Kroll wishes to categorically and aggressively deny any involvement in the fabricated dossier presented by Brianna Whitmore, Coulson stated, staring dead-eyed into the cameras. "Mrs. Whitmore did hire our firm for a standard background check. We provided her with a report stating that Amelia Hayes had a pristine record and zero debt. Mrs. Whitmore, unsatisfied with the truth, chose to illegally forge documents, append our corporate seal to them, and present them as fact." The journalists in the room furiously typed notes as Coulson dropped the hammer. "This is an egregious case of corporate defamation and fraud," Coulson continued. "Consequently, Kroll has filed a $300 million lawsuit against Brianna Whitmore personally. Furthermore, we have handed over all communication records between Mrs. Whitmore and our operatives to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as she utilized interstate wire services to facilitate this fraud. The news hit the Whitmore penthouse like a physical bomb. Brianna frantically tried to call her team of high-powered defense attorneys at Cravath, Swain, and Moore. She was placed on hold for 20 minutes before a junior partner finally picked up. "Jonathan, you need to file an injunction against Krull right now," Brianna commanded, her voice shrill with panic. "They are lying to save their own skin." "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm afraid we cannot represent you," the lawyer said, his voice freezing cold. "Excuse me? I pay your firm millions a year in retainers." "Not anymore, you don't," the lawyer replied bluntly. "The Royal House of Amsberg-Savoy just put our firm on a massive global retainer this morning. It represents a profound conflict of interest for us to represent anyone actively engaged in hostilities with the Crown. You will have to find alternative counsel. Good luck, Mrs. Whitmore. Do not contact this office again." The line went dead. Brianna dropped the phone. She was completely isolated. The legal shield that had protected her family for generations had evaporated overnight. The social ostracization was equally brutal. The elite circles of New York operate on power and proximity to wealth. With the Whitmores now a toxic, bankrupt laughingstock, their friends abandoned them with breathtaking speed. Chloe Whitmore, who had cruelly ruined Amelia's dress on the morning of the wedding, arrived at the exclusive Soho House Club on Wednesday afternoon for a lunch meeting. When she handed her membership card to the concierge, the woman at the desk didn't even smile. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore," the concierge said loudly enough for the crowded lobby to hear. "Your membership has been permanently revoked by the board of directors. Security will escort you off the premises." Chloe's face burned with humiliation as two large bouncers essentially marched her out onto the cobblestone street in front of a dozen giggling socialites. Later that evening, Chloe received an email from Anna Wintour's office. Her invitation to the upcoming Met Gala had been formally rescinded. She was effectively exiled from Manhattan society. Desperation breeds severe delusions. Preston Whitmore, stripped of his future inheritance, his reputation, and the only woman who had ever genuinely cared about him, convinced himself that he could still fix it. He believed that underneath the crown and the royal guards, Amelia was still a sweet girl who loved him. He just needed to talk to her face to face. On Thursday night, Preston packed a small duffel bag, bypassed his frozen credit cards by using a small emergency stash of cash, and bought a commercial ticket to Europe. He flew into the capital city of the sovereign principality, intending to march up to the palace gates and beg for forgiveness. He didn't even make it out of the airport as Preston stepped off the plane and walked toward the customs checkpoint. 4 massive men in sleek black suits and earpieces stepped out from behind a security door. They didn't look like standard airport police. They were the Royal Guard. They flanked Preston instantly, grabbing him firmly by the arms and dragging him into a windowless, concrete interrogation room deep in the bowels of the international terminal. Preston was thrown into a hard, metal chair. He sat there, terrified, sweating, and shaking for 3 hours. No one spoke to him. No one offered him water. Finally, the heavy metal door clicked open. It wasn't Amelia. It was Ambassador Henrik von Teyssen, carrying a thin leather briefcase. "Ambassador!" Preston cried out, standing up. "Please, I need to see her. I need to explain. My mother lied to me. If I could just talk to Amelia." "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore," the ambassador barked, his voice cracking like a whip. Preston collapsed back into the chair. "Her Royal Highness has no desire to see you, speak to you, or acknowledge your existence ever again," the ambassador said, opening his briefcase and pulling out a single sheet of heavy watermarked paper. "You are an embarrassment to yourself and a parasite to her memory." "She loved me," Preston pleaded, tears streaming down his face. She loved the illusion of a man who possessed a spine, the ambassador corrected coldly. An illusion you shattered quite thoroughly. You are currently standing on sovereign soil. By order of the king, you have been classified as a threat to the crown. You are permanently banned from entering this country and any allied European territories. The ambassador slid the paper across the metal table. It was a formal decree of persona non grata. Furthermore, the ambassador continued, leaning in close, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. If you ever attempt to contact Her Royal Highness again, by phone, by mail, through a proxy, or by showing your cowardly face near her, the financial ruin your family is currently experiencing will be considered a mercy compared to what we will do to you. The ambassador stood up, snapping his briefcase shut. Put him on the next commercial flight back to Newark. The ambassador ordered the guards. Middle seat, coach. As Preston was dragged back through the airport, surrounded by guards, he looked up at a massive television screen hanging in the terminal. The news was playing. It showed footage of his father's hedge fund office in Manhattan. FBI agents and windbreakers were carrying boxes of hard drives out the front door, investigating the forged documents his mother had paid for. The camera cut to a shot of Amelia. She was standing on a balcony of the royal palace, overlooking a cheering crowd of thousands. She was smiling, a genuine, radiant, unburdened smile. She was wearing a simple, elegant dress, looking more beautiful than Preston had ever seen her. She looked entirely, completely free. And as the guards shoved Preston onto the crowded, cramped airplane to fly back to the smoldering ruins of his life, he finally understood the absolute, devastating magnitude of what he had thrown away. The financial bleeding of Whitmore Capital was not a slow leak. It was a severed artery. By the second week following the catastrophic wedding, the firm was officially insolvent. The SEC had suspended Charles Whitmore's trading licenses, and the FBI's white-collar crime division had cordoned off the entire 45th floor of his Midtown headquarters. They weren't just looking for forged Kroll documents anymore. The sudden, massive withdrawal of European funds had exposed decades of Charles's reckless over-leveraging and hidden, toxic assets. But for Brianna Whitmore, the loss of the company was abstract. She didn't understand derivative markets or margin calls. What she understood was real estate, jewelry, and art, and that was exactly what the bankruptcy courts targeted first. 3 months after the disastrous day at St. Patrick's Cathedral, the Whitmore family was served with eviction notices. The sprawling, multi-level Central Park penthouse, which had been the crown jewel of Brianna's social empire for 30 years, was seized to satisfy the massive debts owed to creditors. Everything inside, the antique French furniture, the diamond necklaces, the rare first-edition books, and their legendary private art collection, was catalogued, packed into padded crates, and sent to Sotheby's for a brutal, expedited liquidation auction. The evening of the auction, the atmosphere at Sotheby's New York headquarters was electric. It was the social equivalent of a public execution, and Manhattan's elite turned out in droves to pick at the carcass of the Whitmore empire. Brianna, Charles, and Preston were not allowed to attend, but Brianna sat in a rented, cramped, 2-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, obsessively refreshing the live-streamed auction on her cracked iPad. The auctioneer, a sharply dressed man with a crisp British accent, took his place at the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, we begin tonight's highly anticipated estate liquidation with lot number 1, the auctioneer announced, gesturing to a massive screen, displaying a breathtaking 17th-century Dutch masterpiece that had hung over the Whitmore's grand fireplace. Opening the bidding at $4 million, paddles immediately flew up across the room. The price skyrocketed. $5 million. 7 million. 9 million. Brianna watched, her heart pounding. If the art sold for astronomical prices, perhaps there would be enough left over after the creditors to salvage some semblance of their old life. "I have 12 million, the auctioneer called out. "Do I hear 13? Before anyone could raise a paddle, a red light blinked on the auctioneer's console. It was a proxy bid from an exclusive pre-registered international telephone client. "I have a bid from the phones," the auctioneer said, his eyebrows raising slightly as he read the digital monitor. $25 million. A collective gasp echoed through the auction house. It was an aggressive bullying bid, designed to instantly shut down the room. 25 million, the auctioneer repeated. Fair warning, and sold. Lot number 2 was brought out, Brianna's prized collection of Cartier diamond necklaces. The exact same telephone bidder doubled the highest room offer instantly. Sold. Lot after lot, the pattern repeated. The anonymous telephone bidder was absolutely relentless, sweeping the floor with limitless capital. They bought the Whitmore Summer Estate in Newport, Rhode Island. They bought Charles's vintage Ferrari collection. They bought every single piece of antique furniture, every painting, every silver tea set. By the end of the 4-hour auction, a single anonymous entity had purchased the entirety of the Whitmore estate for an unprecedented, staggering sum. In Queens, Brianna was hyperventilating with relief. "Charles!" she yelled into the tiny kitchen, where her husband was grimly drinking cheap vodka out of a water glass. "Someone bought it all, for double the estimates. We might actually see some of that money." The next morning, the identity of the anonymous buyer was legally required to be filed with the bankruptcy court, making it public record. The New York Times ran the story on the front page. The buyer was not a hedge fund. It was not a tech billionaire. It was the Amelia Helene Royal Arts and Heritage Foundation, a charitable trust entirely funded and directed by the sovereign crown of Habsburg Savoy. Amelia had bought everything, but she didn't buy it to keep it. The press release issued by Ambassador Henrik von Thyssen outlined the princess's plans for her new acquisitions. The Newport Summer Estate was immediately donated to the state of Rhode Island to be converted into a tuition-free rehabilitation center for underprivileged youths. The jewelry and cars were liquidated at private European auctions, with every cent of the proceeds funneled directly into a massive grant for struggling archivists and art restorers in Brooklyn. But the final, most devastating blow was reserved for the Central Park penthouse. Amelia didn't sell it. Instead, she officially petitioned the Zoning Board of Manhattan to reclassify the historic, multi-million-dollar residential space. With the heavy influence of royal lawyers and endless capital, the permits were approved in record time. The former Whitmore penthouse, the very room where Brianna had slammed a draconian prenuptial agreement on the desk and demanded Amelia sign her life away, was entirely gutted. The marble was ripped out. The grand chandeliers were taken down. Princess Amelia transformed the most exclusive, arrogant piece of real estate in New York City into a public, fully accessible, free community center for at-risk women facing domestic financial abuse. It was named the Hayes Center. When Brianna read the headline, she didn't scream. She didn't throw a tantrum. The psychological weight of her total, absolute defeat finally crushed her. She simply dropped the newspaper onto the cheap linoleum floor of her Queens apartment, walked into her tiny windowless bedroom, and locked the door. She didn't come out for 3 days. The Queen of Manhattan had been buried in the very dirt she had tried to throw. A year passed, and the Whitmore name transitioned from a tragic headline into a cautionary tale whispered in the hallowed halls of Ivy League business schools. The absolute destruction of their lives was comprehensive, sparing no one in the family. Charles Whitmore faced the music on a freezing Tuesday morning in February. Following a relentless 11-month investigation, the Department of Justice indicted him on 72 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and massive financial negligence. The man who used to command boardrooms with a single grunt was perp walked out of a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, his hands cuffed behind his back, looking 20 years older than his actual age. The judge, citing Charles as a severe flight risk given his international connections, denied bail. The Titan of Wall Street was sent to the Metropolitan Detention Center, trading his bespoke Brioni suits for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He would eventually plead guilty to avoid a trial, receiving a 15-year federal prison sentence. Chloe Whitmore, the sister who had maliciously ruined Amelia's wedding dress, found out very quickly that an expensive liberal arts degree in art history is functionally useless when your last name is blacklisted from every museum, gallery, and auction house on the Eastern Seaboard. Stripped of her trust fund and evicted from her luxury condo, Chloe was forced to actually work for a living. She managed to secure a job, but it was a far cry from the front rows of Fashion Week. Chloe was hired as a junior floor associate at a high-end department store on Fifth Avenue, just 3 blocks away from St. Patrick's Cathedral. She spent her days wearing a drab, black uniform, aggressively pushing perfume samples onto wealthy tourists and biting her tongue until it bled as former friends and socialites walked past her makeup counter, blatantly ignoring her while whispering cruel jokes behind their designer handbags. The irony of spending her life serving the very women she used to mock was a daily, agonizing punishment. Then there was Preston. Preston's descent was the steepest because he had the furthest to fall. He was a man who had never made a single difficult choice in his life, and when stripped of his mother's protection and his father's money, he discovered he possessed absolutely no survival skills. No Wall Street firm would touch him. His Yale connections evaporated, treating his phone numbers like a virus. The persona non grata decree from the Habsburg-Savoy family made him a radioactive liability to any multinational corporation. Eventually, sheer hunger and impending homelessness forced Preston into the manual labor sector. He secured a job working for a boutique logistics and art handling company in Brooklyn. It was grueling, back-breaking work. For 12 hours a day, Preston wore steel-toed boots, thick canvas gloves, and a sweat-stained uniform, loading heavy wooden crates into the backs of un-air-conditioned box trucks. His hands, once manicured and soft, became heavily calloused and scarred. His posture, once arrogant and upright, slumped under the physical and emotional weight of his new reality. He lived in a cramped, moldy studio apartment in deep Brooklyn, eating cheap takeout and staring at the peeling paint on his ceiling. Every night before he managed to drift off to an exhausted sleep, Preston's mind would betray him. He would replay that moment at the altar, over and over again. He would hear his mother's shrieking voice. He would see Amelia's steady, calm eyes pleading with him to trust her. He would feel the exact, sickening moment he let go of her hand and stepped backward. The realization that he had held true, unconditional love and limitless, historic power in the palm of his hand and had thrown it away out of pure cowardice was a poison that ate him alive from the inside out. He didn't just miss the money. He missed her. He missed the quiet Sunday mornings in her old apartment. He missed the way she smelled like old paper and vanilla. He missed the only person who had ever looked at him and seen a man instead of a trust fund. But regret is a ghost that offers no comfort, and Preston was about to learn that the universe has an incredibly dark sense of humor. It was a crisp, brilliantly sunny Tuesday in October when Preston's logistics dispatcher handed him his clipboard for the afternoon route. "We got a high-value transport, Whitmore," the dispatcher barked, chewing on a stale cigar. "A newly restored 16th century tapestry going to the Upper East Side. Handle it like it's made of glass. One scratch and it comes out of your paycheck for the next 10 lifetimes." Preston looked at the delivery address on the manifest. His stomach instantly dropped into his boots. It was the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Amelia's old workplace. Preston hadn't set foot in the Met, or even the Upper East Side since the wedding. The very thought of driving back into the territory he used to rule made him physically nauseous. But a refusal meant getting fired, and his rent was already 2 weeks past due. He grabbed his heavy leather gloves and climbed into the passenger seat of the rusted box truck. When they arrived at the museum's subterranean loading dock, the atmosphere was chaotic. Security was unbelievably tight. There were men in dark suits, with earpieces stationed at every access door, communicating quietly into their lapels. "What's going on?" Preston's driver asked a loading dock manager as they backed the truck in. "Looks like the president is here." "Better," the manager muttered, checking their IDs intensely. "Major international benefactor is doing a private walkthrough of the new medieval wing. Royal family stuff. Just keep your heads down, move the crate to Restoration Room 4, and get out." Preston's blood turned to ice water. Royal family. He pulled his baseball cap down low over his eyes, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He grabbed his end of the heavy wooden crate, his muscles strained as he and his partner navigated the labyrinthine concrete hallways beneath the museum, moving toward the employee elevators. They reached the 4th floor, the restoration department. This was exactly where Preston had first met Amelia. The familiar smell of solvents, aged linen, and dust hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He kept his head down, staring intensely at the linoleum floor, praying to a god he rarely spoke to that he could just drop the crate and leave. "Hold there, please," a sharp European-accented voice commanded. Preston froze. 2 massive men in immaculate dark suits stepped into the hallway, blocking their path. Behind them, the heavy glass doors of the primary restoration lab were propped open. Inside the lab, surrounded by the museum's frantic, overly eager board of directors, was Princess Amelia. Preston couldn't help himself. He slowly looked up from beneath the brim of his dirty cap. She was breathtaking. The subtle, quiet archivist he had known was entirely replaced by a woman of supreme, terrifying elegance. She wore a tailored emerald green coat that draped perfectly over her shoulders, her hair styled in sleek, effortless waves. She was laughing, a bright, genuine sound, as the chief curator showed her a piece of newly recovered parchment. She radiated power, confidence, and total, unshakable peace. She looked absolutely nothing like the girl he had abandoned. "We're just moving this to Bay 4, Preston's partner grunted, struggling under the weight of the crate. "Wait one moment," Amelia's voice carried out into the hallway. She turned away from the curator and stepped toward the door, her eyes catching the wooden crate. "Is that the Flemish tapestry from the Brussels acquisition?" "Yes, Your Highness," the museum director stammered, practically bowing. Amelia stepped out into the hallway, flanked by her security detail. She was no more than 5 feet away from Preston. He stopped breathing entirely. His hands, gripping the rough wood of the crate, began to shake uncontrollably. He kept his face angled down, desperate for the shadows of his cap to hide him. "Excellent," Amelia said, stepping closer to inspect the shipping labels on the side of the crate. As she leaned in, the faint, familiar scent of vanilla and expensive European perfume washed over Preston. It was a cruel, sensory dagger straight to his heart. "Be careful unpacking the top left corner," Amelia instructed, speaking directly to Preston's partner. The threading there is incredibly fragile. The historical society almost ruined it during transit last month. Yes, ma'am, I mean, Your Highness, the partner nervously replied. Amelia nodded gently, a polite, impersonal smile on her lips. Then her eyes briefly flicked over to the other man holding the crate. She looked directly at Preston. Preston slowly raised his eyes. For one agonizing, suspended second, their gazes locked. Preston's eyes were bloodshot, filled with a swirling hurricane of regret, shame, and desperate, pathetic sorrow. He looked at her like a dying man, looking at water. Amelia looked back at him. Her expression didn't change. There was no gasp of shock. There was no flash of anger. There wasn't even a glimmer of vindictive triumph. There was absolutely nothing. Her eyes washed over his dirty uniform, his calloused hands, and his broken posture with the polite, empty disinterest of someone observing a stranger on a subway. He wasn't a memory. He wasn't a villain. He was just a man holding a box. She held his gaze for perhaps half a second, then seamlessly turned her attention back to the museum director. "Shall we proceed to the Renaissance Gallery?" Amelia asked, her voice light and cheerful. "Right this way, Your Highness," the director said, leading the entourage down the hall. The royal guard fell into step behind her, their heavy shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor. Within seconds she was gone, disappearing around the corner, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of vanilla. "Hey! Earth to Whitmore!" his partner snapped, jolting the crate. "You gonna stand there all day, or are we moving this thing?" Preston blinked, tearing his eyes away from the empty hallway. A single hot tear broke loose, cutting a clean track down his dusty cheek. He tightened his grip on the heavy wood until his knuckles turned entirely white. "Yeah," Preston whispered, his voice cracking, sounding like a man who had finally accepted his own death sentence. "I've got it. Let's move." He lowered his head, hoisted the weight of the crate onto his aching shoulders, and carried it into the shadows of the storage room, completely erased from the world, of the woman who used to be his entire universe. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the ultimate definition of poetic justice. The Whitmore family thought they could bully, humiliate, and destroy a woman just because she didn't fit their arrogant, shallow standard of wealth. They thought they held all the cards, right up until Princess Amelia dropped the entire deck on their heads. They traded a $1 trillion royal dynasty, and more importantly, a genuinely brilliant and loving woman, for a fake Kroll folder and a massive ego trip. If this story gave you absolute chills and satisfied every single craving you have for instant karma, you have to hit that like button right now. Share this video with a friend who loves a massive, satisfying plot twist. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell notifications so you never miss another deep dive into these wild, real-life dramas. What was your favorite moment of Amelia's revenge? Was it the helicopter extraction or the Sotheby's auction? Let me know down in the comments, and I will see you all in the next episode.